Well, I got a lot to say today, and I have this horrible feeling that because of the rawness of where I'm at right now, that this is going to come out in spits and sputters. And I don't know if you know what that. I just been going through a lot myself, but mostly going through a lot of things with other people who are, as we sang about, going through really storms of life. And those storms have kind of stopped them in their track, and they're wondering where God is and what God's doing in this moment. And so for me, it's like, I think this message speaks to that, and that's how God usually works. I'll never forget the last time I really talked about this topic, and we're talking about a guy named Joseph. It was September 17th, 2001. I don't know if you know what, that was the Sunday after 9/11, 2001. And it was planned already. I'd kind of planned out the whole series ahead of time, and so it just fell in that. And I talked about Joseph and his life, and it really hit the spot. I mean, we were all kind of grieving in that moment. But recently, I was talking to somebody who went through a really difficult experience, September 11th, a number of years before the one that we know about, and he lost his adult son in a car accident. And I just found this out recently and was talking to him about him, and I thought about what he thinks about on September 11th is completely different than what we think about on September 11th. It runs deep for him, and the pain is nearly unbearable. And it changed the course of his life. It changed the way he looks at certain days and looks at certain relationships. And I thought about that. Just the way sometimes experiences that we have, they impact us. For him, that experience then led to other experiences and events and memories and time together that would never come to pass because of that instant tragedy. And his story was changed. And as we talk about the story over these last couple of weeks and then the next couple of months, as we talk about the story of God, you're going to see events that happen in the people of God in the scriptures, and it really did transform that moment in time. And in that moment, what I think is true, in that moment, we all often think that there is nothing that can come good out of this. Now, I don't know, when you lose a loved one, I'm not sure if there's anything that ever is good that comes out of it. But I think most of us can think back on certain events in our lives, experience that we've had, that in the moment they felt so negative, so horrible, so disastrous that we thought there is nothing that can come good out of this. Nothing good is going to come out of this experience. And then later on, years later, in looking back, we can see, oh my gosh, I think God was using that moment, that experience, to shape my heart, to mold me into the person that he wants me to be, to transform the way I see the world, to maybe redirect me into a new way of living, a new path that I was going on, and eventually to really fulfill the calling that he had on your life, my life. And only when we look back after a long time do we see that those events that we thought in the moment were so disastrous and so crippling and so painful, we see, looking back, that God was actually using them to change us, to make us different people. So we're talking about the story of God, the story through the scriptures. And what we said last week, and we've kind of been talking about this for the last couple of weeks, is that it is the grand plan of God, the great plan of God as it unfolds in the scripture, is that he is relentlessly pursuing the people that he lost in the garden, though he used to be in perfect fellowship with them. Remember that God created the entire universe out of the joy that was overflowing out of his own Trinitarian existence. Out of that joy came all of creation, and then us, his people, his crowning glory. But we messed it up. We fell. We disobeyed God. And I would love to just blame those guys, but I do it too, and you do it too. And so we all have fallen. And yet God, even in that moment, said, I'm going to get those guys back because I love them and I want them. And so his grand plan, his grand scheme throughout the scriptures is to relentlessly pursue the people whom he loves. And if you were with us last week, we talked about this guy named Abraham. and this incredible call that God had in his life. He was, after like everybody had kind of wandered throughout and spread out throughout the known world, he comes to a guy who is an idol worship, and he says, hey, guess what? I am going to make a great nation out of you. I'll bless you and make you famous. I'll make your name great, and you'll be a blessing to others. The people who bless you, I'll bless them, and those who curse you, I'll curse them. And in the end, all the families on the earth will be blessed through you. And he's got to believe, like, what? I don't even have a family yet. If you know, remember back, Abram and Sarai were married, and yet they were childless. Abram means father, and yet he was not a father at all. Sarai means princess. She wasn't a princess. She didn't have anybody who was her heir. She didn't rule over anybody. And then Sarai kind of took it into her own hands, and Abram said, okay, I'll go with that. Sarai gave Abram her servant, Hagar, and they had a son, Ishmael, and when they had that son, Ishmael, they thought, okay, maybe this is the way. No, God said, no, that's not how I wanted to do it. Remember, I gave you a promise that I was going to make heirs of you, Abraham and Sarah. You were going to be the ones who populated the earth. You were the ones who were going to bless the entire world. And I have promised that over and over. Even the stars up in the sky are too few to count. Your descendants are going to be greater than that, greater than the sands on the shore. It is going to be an enormous nation, and through that nation, I am going to bless the entire world. That was the way God was going to go about in completing this plan. And so, how cool it is, he fulfills his promise, and Sarai becomes pregnant, has a son named Isaac, which means joy, and that's kind of cool. And he changes their name. Abraham is from Abram. Abraham means the father of many nations. Sarai becomes Sarah, and she is going to be the queen of many nations, and Isaac is going to be the one who is descending from that. But then that crazy story from last week, where God says, I want you, Abraham, to take Isaac, your son, your only son, the son whom you love, and I want you to sacrifice him on the mountain that I will show you. And it comes to pass that that mountain is the same mountain that God would take his son, his one and only son, the son whom he loves, Jesus, and he would sacrifice him on that mountain. And so we see already unfolding in the pictures and the story and the narrative and the images of the Old Testament, we see that God is up to something. He's doing something for us. He is providing a sacrifice, and that's what happens. I mean, right at the point where Abraham is ready to plunge the knife into his son, he says, wait, stop, don't do that. Don't lay a hand on him. No, because I'm going to provide. Don't do anything to that son whom you love, because now I realize that you have not even withheld your son, your only son, from me. And when I read that phrase, that Abraham didn't even withhold his only son from God, and I think that's exactly what God did for us. He did not even withhold his only son, the son that he loved, just like Abraham. He gave up his son. But God said, wait, I got a sacrifice for you. And he looks up and he sees this ram, and the horns are caught in the thicket, so he grabs it and puts it on a burnt offering and slices and sacrifices. And then Abraham names this place Yahweh Yireh, which means God will provide. And sure enough, eventually God will provide a sacrifice. A couple thousand years after and 1,000 years ago, he gives us his only son, the son whom he loves, Jesus. And Jesus sacrifices his life so that we can be made right with God. Well, Isaac grows up, and Abraham's ready to die. And so Abraham says to his servant, I want you to go back to my homeland, and I want you to get a wife for my son, because this nation has to grow. And so the servant goes back, finds Rebekah from the household that they grew up in. And so servant brings Rebekah back. Isaac and Rebekah look and they go, yes, we're going to get married. She's beautiful. He's good looking too. And let's go. And they start trying to have babies, and it's not happening. It's not happening. This seems to be a common theme amongst the New Testament or the Old Testament right in the beginning, is that nobody can have any babies with the right people. It's crazy. But eventually Isaac prays, and he gets two sons, Jacob and Esau. And it's kind of a funny story because Esau's coming out, and Jacob has his grabbing his ankle and pull me out. And it's always funny because I'm reminded of when little Bailey was born, my youngest daughter. She was transverse, and so she was sideways. And when the nurse went to check and see if Dana was ready to give birth, Bailey grabbed the lady's finger. And you should have seen the nurse just freak out. Oh, what was that? There's a growth inside. Well, yeah, it's a baby. But yeah, usually they don't grab my finger. So I thought that, yeah, Jacob. We were going to name her Jacob, but then she was a girl, so we went with Bailey. And Jacob, you could tell because he was smooth, but Esau was really fuzzy. So Fuzzy Wuzzy was an Esau, and Jacob were brothers. They did not get along at all. Esau and Isaac were buddies. Isaac loved that Esau went out and got game and came in and cooked it for him. Jacob kind of stayed at home, was kind of a mama's boy with Rebekah. Eventually, they really have a falling out. Jacob steals Esau's birthright and his blessing, and so Rebekah says, Jake, you better get out of here. And so go back to where we grew up, where I grew up, and where we started from. And so I think you'll be fine from there. And so Jacob goes back to a place. He leaves Canaan, what is going to be the promised land, which eventually will be Israel. And he goes back to Ur in Mesopotamia. And so he travels back there. And when he gets there, he finds a person who is a relative. And Jacob then finds a beautiful girl. And Laban is her dad, and Laban says, hey, you're working for free. I should pay you something even though you're a relative. And he says, how about you give me Rachel? I think she's beautiful, and I'd love to have her as my wife. And he says, okay, fine. Work 7 years, and we can do that. And so 7 years goes by, and he is so smitten that it felt like a day. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to marry Rachel. She is so beautiful. I love her. And then for whatever reason, I don't know how this actually works. It must have been really, really dark because Laban kind of plays a little thing on him and gives him Leah, her older sister, Rachel's older sister. And so they get married, and Jacob wakes up and goes, hey, that's not Rachel, that's Leah. I didn't want her. How horrible Leah must have felt. And sure enough, the Bible talks about her feeling just horrible about herself and about not being loved at all. Well, Laban's nice enough to give Jacob Rachel as well, and so he has 2 wives. And they, I don't know if that's a blessing or not. It would be in my life if I had 2 of Dana's, but I don't know about you. You can tell her I said that, please. So Leah and Jacob have a few kids. They have Reuben and Simeon and Levi and Judah. And Judah's pretty cool because he winds up being the ancestor of our Messiah, Jesus. They're going to have a lot of kids. Well, Rachel sees this and says, wait a second, I'm not having any kids. What's the problem here? And once again, she gives Jacob her servant girl. Her name is Bilhah, and she has a couple kids, Dan and Naphtali. And, the kids just keep on coming out. Leah's kind of angry. She's not having any kids, so she gives Jacob her servant girl, Zilpah, and they have some kids. And so then Leah has some more kids. And you got to wonder, hey, what's Rachel feeling like? Well, she's bummed out on this point. She's like, wait a second, why don't I have any kids? And in Jacob's old age, they finally get that son, Joseph, the son that he loves so much, the dude with the really cool coat, the Technicolor dream coat, and then later they get the little Benjamin guy. And so if you understand how the tribes of Israel works, Jacob is going to go and try to make it right with Esau, and they come together. But while he's going there, he wrestles with God about this reunion, and sure enough, God changes his name to Israel. And so if you've ever heard of the 12 tribes of Israel, it's the 12 sons of Jacob. And so hopefully this is news to everybody, but some of you are going, oh, is that how that worked? Now I understand it. So the 12 tribes of Israel are the 12 sons of Jacob by all these different women. And so we come to the place where in the Bible, the story talks about Joseph, Jacob's son. And so Genesis chapter 37, if you have a Bible, you want to jump to there, you can do that. We're going to go through the story pretty quickly, and I think at the end, I'm going to hopefully wrap it up to help you see that even if you're going through difficult times, and I would say in the mundane, pay the bills, go to work, have illnesses, have struggles, the mundane parts of life, that even in those parts of your life, God is still doing something very large and very grand in the world, and He is calling you to be a part of that experience. Oftentimes, I think about it as the upper story of God, the grand narrative, the grand story of God in pursuing His people, the people that He lost in the Garden of Eden, but He desperately wants to get back. That is the grand story. That is the grand scheme of things in God's eyes. That's what He's doing. And He wants to use all of us to do that, but oftentimes we get so focused on the everyday, mundane things of our lives, or the struggles, or the storms, or the obstacles, that we kind of miss what God is doing. And yet, if we can see with His eyes, we can realize that what He's doing, even in our mundane life, and sometimes even in the storms of our lives, the struggles of our lives, He is preparing us for something great in the future. And you see that in Joseph's life amazingly. I was thinking about, and this is, one instance of this, very small. Samantha, my daughter, plays volleyball, and she's now done. And one of her best friends on the team was the setter, Abby. And her parents live in Cleveland. They're good friends of ours. And she never played until her senior year in college. She just happened to be behind one of the best setters in Taylor volleyball history, and so she just could not get above her. She couldn't get playing time. She always practiced, but never got into games. And there were times where she said, "This is ridiculous. Why am I doing this? Why am I practicing? I never get into games. I should just quit. I just quit." And she didn't. She had a choice to make. Like in the struggle of, am I really here for a reason, or am I just kind of going through the motions? And they did a little video story on her at Taylor, and she said, I had to come to a place where I made a choice to say, okay, even in this struggle, and it's a little struggle, it's a small struggle, and we all have small struggles all the way up to big struggles. And for her, it was a small struggle, but it was so, right in front of her face for 3 years. She said, I had to make a choice. Is God calling me to be a part of this team, to be a part of this university, to be a part of this story? And is He doing anything in me so that when I'm done with this, maybe He will have transformed my heart, changed me? And it was amazing how she just said, you know what? God dealt with me in my pride. He dealt with me in how I looked at other teammates. He dealt with me on how I was to encourage and support and be a part of the team, even though I was never getting playing time. And it changed the way I saw my life. I don't have to be in the spotlight. In fact, I can play a supporting role, and it's a bigger part of the whole than if I was out on the court myself. And I think those are the things that God tries to teach us when we're in a place of great confusion or struggle, is that in that moment, God is actually doing something to shape you, to mold your character, to transform you into the person you need to be, so that later in life, when you're called upon to do something that He has laid upon your heart, He's prepared you for years and years and years so that you're ready in that moment. So Joseph is 17 years old. He's one of the youngest sons of his father, and he works as a shepherd. He works with all of his other brothers, but it's funny. Joseph was can you say narc? He was a tattletale. He told on his brothers. He told his father all the bad things they were doing, and so they didn't really like him that much. And Jacob loved Joseph, obviously because Rachel was the mom, and he had him in his old age. And so, of course, he even gave him this really cool gift. And parents, learn this one, okay? If you're going to get a really cool gift for one of your kids, get it for all of your kids. Don't show favoritism. If anything, we are learning about favoritism in parenting. It's bad throughout, and yet these people are doing it all the time. Isn't it comforting sometimes that He can work through horrible parents to raise up a great nation? He might even be able to work through you. And then Joseph does something really, I think, so lame, It's like, this is not intelligent here. This is not relationally intelligent. He says to his brothers, hey, guys, guess what? I had a dream last night. And it was kind of a great dream. Listen to this dream. I was in a field, and you were in the field, and then all of a sudden, we became like heads of grain. And my head of grain rose up really big. It stood up really tall, and your bundles all gathered around me and bowed low before me. And they look at him and go, should we kill him now or later? He has another dream, tells his dad, and the dad goes, oh, son, they don't like you already because of that stupid coat. You shouldn't share this stuff with them. And so one day, Jacob says, hey, go out and check on your brothers. Maybe you can give a bad report again. And he goes out and checks on them. And it's kind of interesting because they see him coming at a distance. And I don't know how, like, you've ever, like, I just can't imagine the 10 of them, I mean, the one, like, he's got this really colorful coat on, right? And so the sun's shining on him. I was like, oh, look who's coming. The dude with the glowing coat. And they really do. They say, we should kill him. We're so sick. He keeps on ratting on us, and Dad shows him so much favoritism. He thinks he's going to rule over us someday. He's the punk kid. Let's just kill him. And so they think about it. We can kill him. We can soak the coat in some blood and then give it to Dad and say, I don't know, sorry, a wild animal killed him. Now, for whatever reason, they changed their mind. Judah, we talked about Judah being the one of the line of promise where our Messiah comes. He says, wait, let's not kill him. That would be bad to do to our brother. So why don't we instead just sell him off to these guys? They're leaving. They're going to Egypt. One, we can get a little bit of money for him, and he will never show up again. We can get rid of him. Isn't that awesome? And that's what they do. And so Joseph goes with a band of Midianites, Ishmaelites, the people that, you remember that old line of the Hagar and Ishmael? They take him down to Egypt. And when he gets down to Egypt, they sell him to a guy who is the head of the palace guard. So, interesting thing, though, the Bible says this a number of times. The Lord was with Joseph. Now, I want to stop right there, because I have to believe that there have been times in your life when you went through an experience like Joseph, that you were sold down the river, you were thrown under the bus, you were made to experience punishment, and you had done nothing wrong. And in that moment, you probably said, where is God in this? How can I be going through this if there is a good God, a loving God in heaven? And here's where it says, no. The Lord was with Joseph. He was still with Joseph in this horrible experience. Even though he was going through slavery, he was being sold off. He would never see his family again. At this point, he thinks, I can't believe it. My brothers, my mom, my dad, my little brother Ben, I'm never going to see them again. And yet, even in that moment, the Bible says the Lord was with him. How many of you have gone through an event in your life when you thought, that's it, God has kind of forgotten me? That's not true. It might be that God is more with you in that moment than moments when you're riding high. The Lord was with Joseph. He succeeded in everything he did. So he goes to Potiphar, and Potiphar makes Joseph his personal attendant. He puts Joseph in charge of everything he owns, which is great, except he spends a lot of time at Potiphar's house. And because he was good looking, Potiphar's wife takes a look at him and says, I like him. I want him. And that's not good. So she says to him, hey, I want you to come sleep with me. But Joseph is, no, that would be horrible. I can't sin like that. It would be this horrible sin against God. That would be wicked. I will not do it. Then she kind of coaxes him to do it again, and he runs off. She grabs the cloak, of course. She then says to everybody, look at this guy. This guy tried to rape me. And Potiphar was irritated. He was frustrated. He was so angry, furious with Joseph. And so he throws him into prison where the king's prisoners were held. And there he remained. It says that he was about 17 in the beginning of our story. That's where we start talking about Joseph and the fact that his brothers didn't like him much. By the time he's here, he's 30. And it says that he spends about 10 years in prison. Now, I don't know about you. There have been moments in my life when I felt I was locked in prison. I was an alcoholic for a number of years, and so it felt like a prison. There were times when I would do something so foolish that people would look down upon me, and it was as they should, and I felt like that was a prison. That I would never get out of that idea of a reputation. Have you ever been in a place where you would consider now, that felt like prison? I was imprisoned in that. And here's where Joseph remains there. But here's crazy, right? Genesis 39. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. So, because God was with him, Joseph became in charge of the prison. He worked the prison even though he was a prisoner. Everything in the prison he took care of. It was crazy. And then something happens. Two of the other prisoners, one day they look horrible. Their face is like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. I can't understand. And Joseph asks, what's going on with you? Well, we both had dreams and we don't know what they mean. And we're worried about this. And he says, well, I serve a God who understands dreams, and he can interpret those dreams. So why don't you tell me what the dreams were? And the two people tell the dreams, and the cupbearer tells a dream, and he thinks, what's going to happen? And Joseph announces, guess what? In 3 days' time, you're going to go back. You're going to leave prison. You're going to go back to the Pharaoh, and you're going to be the Pharaoh's cupbearer once again. And when you do this, please remember me. Please tell him that I'm here and that I didn't do anything wrong even though I'm still here. And maybe Pharaoh would get me out of here. He tells the other guy, oh, you're going to be impaled on a post. Sorry. But it all happens just the same as he had said. But it says when the cupbearer goes back to the Pharaoh, he completely forgets Joseph for about 2 years. And then Pharaoh has some crazy dreams. And he's saying, wait a second, I don't understand these dreams. Can anybody tell me what these dreams mean? And the cupbearer goes, oh my gosh, I remember there was a guy in prison and he was able to interpret dreams. You should call for him. And Pharaoh does. He calls for him. And Pharaoh explains the dreams. He says, I don't know, there was like these cows and these heads of grain, and they were all big and puffed up and huge, and that was great. And there were 7 of them, and then there were 7 little scrawny cows and horrible little withered things. And what does that mean? And Joseph, because God is with him, and because God gives him the power to understand these dreams, Pharaoh even says, I heard that you can do this. And he says, oh, no, it's not about me. It is clearly not about me. It's about God. God can do this. It's beyond my power. It's beyond my strength. It's beyond my comprehension. But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. And here's what the thing means. 7 cows, big fat cows, big heads of grain. It's going to be 7 years of bounty. Bumper crops, it's going to be wonderful. But the 7 scrawny cows, it's 7 years of famine. So here's what you should do. Take about 1/5 of all the produce and put it aside so that the 7 years you will still have food. It'll be okay. And the Pharaoh says, dude, you are brilliant. There's nobody who's as wise as you. I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Now, isn't that crazy? Joseph is in prison. Joseph has been sold off to slavery. And because God was with him and God gave him the ability to interpret these dreams, all of a sudden he is put in charge of everything in Egypt. And just like the story goes, great 7 years and then 7 horrible years. And there is famine all around the world. And he's in charge. Joseph is in charge of selling all the grain and doing all the things. And so his dad, back in the land of Canaan, tells his 10 brothers, he says, hey, go down to Egypt because I heard they have grain down there and we need that grain. We're starving here. And so the 10 brothers go, and they go in front of the guy who's absolutely in charge of everything. Pharaoh's above him, but this guy is in control of all the food. And it says that they bow down before him. When they arrived, Genesis 42, when they arrived, they bowed before him with their faces to the ground, and Joseph recognized his brothers instantly. Now, has anyone ever wronged you in such a way that there's come a point where you now have the chance, the opportunity to seek revenge and exact revenge on them after they've done that to you and a little time has gone by? Have you ever been in that position? What does that feel like? There is okay, this is clearly sinful on my part. There is a giddy power that wells up in you, right? And if you're in the flesh at that moment, you can do a world of hurt, a ton of damage. Joseph doesn't do that. He plays around with him for a little while, but then after he gets, because his goal is to get his dad down, Jacob down to there, and his little brother down to Egypt, and he wants to take care of him. He gets him down there, and he says, I want you to come really close. Like I'm thinking, okay, yeah, you're going to get really close. Swipe him. That's not at all what he does. He says, I want you to come close. I'm Joseph, your brother, the guy who sold into slavery in Egypt. And that can't be. No, they can't be. No, they can't be him. They can't be. It is me. It is me. And at that moment, he does something so profoundly different than most of what we would do if we were put in that position. He says, I understand now. I don't want you to be upset with yourselves. You sold me to slavery. It was a horrible thing. But unbelievably, God has used this to send me ahead so that I can take care of all the good stuff, the food, and prepare for the famine. And what God has used me to do is to preserve people's lives. It's an amazing transformation. When he realizes that all of the lower story, mundane stuff of his life has actually been a part of God's incredible upper story, his grand story to get people back, to save people's lives, he realizes that he was a part of what God was doing, that he completely forgives them. And he says this famous verse, Genesis 50:20. He says, as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. How many of you would say that there have been times when you've gone through storms in your life, God has been very distant from you, you had no idea what God was doing in those moments, but then later, in looking back, realize that God was in the process of molding you, shaping you, preparing you for something that he had planned for you years ago, but that you weren't quite ready for yet. I think of Joseph in his arrogance. I had some dreams. Y'all bowed down to me. And then he went through difficulties. He became humble. He realized that God was going to do whatever he was going to do in his life, that God could work through him to do things that could bring about life. And sure enough, when he saw his brothers, he says, you know what? I can't believe it. What you thought was evil, God has used to do something incredibly great to save the lives of so many. There's a horrible verse in Romans 8 that most people will say to you when you're going through a storm at just the wrong time to rub you the wrong way. And so it's only in those moments where you've come out of that when you can look at this verse and say, okay, wait. That might be true. That might be true about my life. That might be true about the thing that I just went through. It says this, we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. Now, let me just kind of unpack that a little bit. Everything. Like, does that really mean everything? Everything. To work together for the good of, and this is important, of those who absolutely love the Lord. There are some people who kind of give God half of their heart, a little bit of their heart. Hey, thanks for salvation, thanks for heaven, but this life I got on my own. I don't know if that promise is for them. I don't know if that's offered to them. But I know to those who love God and are called according to the purpose that He has placed in them, if they want to be a part of joining God in His grand story of pursuing the people that He lost in Eden but so desperately wants back and has in fact got them back through His Son Jesus, I believe this promise is for you. It's for them. This great plan unfolds with God's relentless pursuit of the people that He absolutely loves and wants back. And I have to ask you, how is He going to use you? Are you one who loves God and is called according to His purpose? How will He use you? And last question here. What is He doing in your life right now? I mean, maybe you're going through an obstacle right now. What is He doing in your life right now to shape you, transform you, redirect you, and prepare you to fully engage in His plan? It was an interesting thing. A number of years ago, I was a part of a church, and when you're a part of a church, you're kind of myopic. You think only about that church. In fact, now as a pastor, I spend a lot of time thinking about what's going on here in the lives of people, what God is doing, what obstacles they're going through. I get a lot of calls about obstacles that they're going through and try to help them see what God might be doing in that moment. But it's a big part of your focus. A number of years ago, I got jettisoned out of a church. That's a nice way of saying it. And in that process, wound up meeting a number of people. One guy was a guy named Mark Anderson. He worked with YWAM. I thought he was just like a normal dude. He actually was like in charge of everything. And one of his friends was named Steve Douglas, who I kind of knew that he was the president of Cru, an organization that goes to college campuses and then throughout the world. And so wound up meeting him, and then a guy named Avery Willis, who was part of the Southern Baptist Convention, and he literally took care of evangelism and discipleship around the world for them. And I wind up in Dayton, Ohio, sitting with them, and I'm like just peon Steve, and I just think they're just normal dudes. In fact, they're actually big. But we're just talking and hanging out, and I hear a story about what God was doing when they were together, and they had realized that as the body of Christ, there were a number of what they call unreached, unengaged people groups. Around the world, there were people who lived in a certain area, and there was no Christians there was no church there was no missionary that was actively engaged in trying to help them know about Jesus. And they said, we have to be a part of making sure that these people who right now no one is trying to reach, we need to be a part of helping them learn about who Jesus is. Now, I have no idea why I was with them. I was sitting at a table kind of close because I couldn't see or something, I couldn't hear. So I walked up to sit at a table, and then they all sat with me. And I started just listening to what they were doing. And when I realized that what they were trying to accomplish was literally to fulfill the Great Commission. The Bible says that God wants every person on the face of the planet to hear about Jesus, have the opportunity to respond to the love of Christ, and then Jesus is actually going to return. It's an interesting thing. It's kind of the fulfillment of this grand plan of God's ultimate relentless pursuit of people. And this week, I was listening to somebody speak about, it's called Finishing the Task. I think it's finishingthetask.org. And what happened a number of years ago with those group of people in picking these unreached and unengaged people groups, this year is the first year where there is now a missionary, a church in every place on earth where there is a people group that's distinct. Usually they have a certain language, a certain belief system, a moral code that binds them together. There's literally a person trying to reach every person on the planet. When we see the grand story of God, our ultimate goal is to see people won back to Him. That His relentless pursuit would be our pursuit, and we would reach out and draw people back to Himself so they can experience His love and grace as He pours out His only Son, His one Son, the Son that He loves. so that we could be made right with him. And I thought about that. I would have never been in that position had I not been graciously jettisoned from my position at the other church. It just happened, I would say, by chance. And yet, in the grand scheme of things, the great privilege to hear about the fulfillment of God's purpose, I just thought, why was I allowed to be a fly on the wall or a person in the seat listening to these guys talk about the fulfillment, the ultimate fulfillment of the Great Commission? I thought, I don't ever want to be so myopic. I want to be a part of what God is doing around the world. And no matter what I'm going through, I realize now that he's using that to mold me, to shape me, transform me, maybe even redirect me so that I can be a part of fulfilling that. And that's what he's doing through all the difficult struggles of your life. And I don't know where you're at right now, but I know a lot of you are struggling with things. And they might be small struggles, they might be huge struggles. But know that God is using them to prepare you for the task that he's calling you to.